Okay, well, it is 6 o'clock and I'm going to give you a little introduction to our webinar at Ford Alpine Gardens tonight. This is our very first in our webinar series, and normally I'd be greeting you at the front door and we would be sharing some refreshments. You may be more comfortable at home tonight because it looks like we're going to have a little rain here tonight. Instead, I hope you're refreshed wherever you are. There we go. We have, this is our first in our series of monthly webinars. In July, we have A Splendid Journey, Famous 19th Century Botanical Explorers with historian Dr. Steve Ruskin, which ties very well with our outdoor exhibit that we have going on right now in Ford Park. In August, we will talk with Lloyd Athern from the Colorado 14ers Initiative, and he will talk about the human impacts in the high alpines on the 14ers. That those environments have been trampled pretty well by peat baggers, and he will talk about the work that volunteers are undertaking to restore those trails. And in September, we'll have Dr. Chris Ray, who will talk about her research on the American pika, an animal that's the canary in the coal mine for climate change in the alpine. And I just received confirmation from Colorado photographer John Fielder, who will virtually join us in November to discuss his new book, Colorado's Highest, the history of naming the 14,000-foot peaks. Every year, Ford Alpine Gardens chooses an annual theme that matches our mission, and this year it is Alpines, Conquerors of the Cold. We will include 13 essential elements of the alpine ecosystem with stunning photographs with photographers like John Fielder and others. And we also right now have an outdoor exhibit, Colorado Botanist Explorers, that you can find throughout Ford Park in Vail. The series of 10 panels includes Edwin James and the Long Expedition. It is the 200th anniversary of the expedition, and Edwin James was the first botanist to record going into the alpine of Colorado. And when he got up there to the high parts of Pikes Peak, he talked about it as a region of astonishing beauty. We at Ford Alpine Gardens have a mission to deepen understanding and promote conservation of alpine plants and fragile mountain environments, and we couldn't do that without your help. Special thanks tonight to Doe Browning and the town of Vail, whose support makes this speaker series possible. And congratulations to the members who won a North American Rock Gardeners Society membership and conference registration in the giveaway today. Hope you enjoy it. And many of you donated the optional $10 fee with the link in registration, and thank you very much for supporting us. And without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. David Inouye. Some of you may remember that David was one of our guest speakers for the Year of the Pollinator annual theme we had in 2017. And he has been observing the plants and animals at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory in Gothic, Colorado, since his graduate school days in 1971. High alpine meadows are definitely a big part of his life. With a data set like that, he can provide solid evidence of the effects of global and regional climate change on the seasonal cycles and abundance of flowering and the insects and other animals that depend on them. David Inouye is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Biology at the University of Maryland, College Park, where he taught courses in conservation biology, ecology, and the interplay between science and the media. He continues his research each summer at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, which is where he is joining us now. You can see that fantastic background he has going on. And his long-term work is supported by the National Science Foundation on phenology, pollination, and demography of wildflowers. He has written countless books and papers on these topics. I have read a number of them, and I don't believe there is an organization or committee that David has not participated in. Just some technical details about this webinar. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll notice there's a little Q&A box. And if you have any questions for David throughout his presentation, please type them in there. And then I will monitor those questions and pass them on to David after his presentation so he can answer for the group. So thank you very much. And I'm going to pass the baton over to David.
Okay, thank you, Nanette, and thanks for the opportunity to let me talk about some of the work that I do here. I'm sorry I can't be doing that in person this evening, but this will be I think, enjoyable way for you to learn something about what I've been doing here. I might mention that one of the pictures that you showed early on in your introduction showed the old man of the mountain flower. And that's actually one that I'm not going to talk about today, but one that I am doing some work with here, tagging individual plants and looking at them each year to see if they're still alive, how much they've grown, and whether they're flowering. And it turns out that's a species that only flowers once and then it dies. A life history strategy that is sometimes referred to as monocarpic, meaning that it only reproduces once and then it dies. So here's a roadmap of some of the things that I want to talk about. I'll just say a little bit about climate and then how that's affecting local climate, in particular snowmelt and snowpack, how that interacts with frost effects, which in turn influence the abundance of flowers and the timing of their flowering. There's also an influence of climate on migration and on the emergence from hibernation of both plants and animals. And that phenology of the animals interacts with the phenology of the flowers to result in pollination. And those seeds will then affect the population biology or the demography of those plants. So those are some of the interactions that I've been studying over the decades here and that I'll talk about this evening. We all know that things are changing with the climate, both globally and regionally. And some of the things that are affecting our climate here in Southwest Colorado include things like the El Nino Southern Oscillation or the ENSO. And that's a cyclical phenomenon with changes every 2 to 7 years. There's something called the Southern Oscillation Index. There's also the Pacific North American pattern. And all of these interact to affect what we see here on the ground in Colorado. Superimposed on those cyclical effects are the fact that the global temperatures are rising and that snow cover is declining. So here's in the bottom a graph showing that globally, or in the Northern Hemisphere, that snow is melting earlier than it used to over this time period from the mid-60s up until present. If you look at the weather station data from Gunnison, Colorado, and that's at 7,683 feet, one of the things that you can pull out of those records is how much of the precipitation that Gunnison gets each year falls as snow versus falls as rain. And there's been a trend, actually since the early 1900s, for that to change to more rain and less snow.
David, I'm not sure if you're trying to share your screen or not, or if we don't have any slides yet.
Okay, let me try again. I did try sharing screen. Okay, can you see those graphs now?
Yes, now we have them. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for letting me know you weren't seeing that. Let me go back just and show you briefly. There's the roadmap that we'll look at. Here's what some of those cycles look like in terms of climate and that are affecting us. And then here's the Gunnison ratio of snow to rain. If we go up to the next highest weather station in this area, that's Crested Butte, up at 8,950 feet. And there it looks like there was a tipping point here, maybe in the late 70s, early 80s. So early on in the 1900s, the ratio was actually trending towards more snow and less rain, but now it's trending towards more rain and less snow, and that of course is bad news for the ski area. Uh, it also is going to influence a number of the other things that I'm going to talk about this evening, including some wildlife. So for instance, we now know that snowshoe hares are increasingly mismatched with their backgrounds because snow is melting earlier while the snowshoe hares are still white. And in the fall, they're turning white before the snow falls, and that results in an increasing rate of predation on those snowshoe hares because they're not as well camouflaged. So we know that the environment's changing, that there are these temperatures happening in temperature, in precipitation. There also seems to be some increased variation, and those changes are happening at a variety of spatial scales, including globally, regionally, and then from what I'm seeing here in the East River Valley near Crested Butte. And that changing ecological environment is having an effect on many of the things that I'm studying. In particular, changes in phenology, and that's a scientific term for the timing of seasonal events. Things like when we see the first flowers, when we see the first marmot emerging from hibernation, when we see the first hummingbirds migrating. Those are all examples of phenology. We now have a USA National Phenology Network, which is based down in Tucson. And if you're interested in how you might contribute to that or what we're learning from this national effort to capture information about the timing of seasonal events, take a look at their website, and they're very reliant on citizen scientists, people who are interested in what's happening and are willing to record observations about what they're seeing in their backyards. Well, the area that I work is southwestern Colorado. Here's an aerial view I took from an airplane a few years ago when we were flying on our way, I think, to Grand Junction. Here's Crested Butte Mountain where the ski area is, and if you drive up the East River Valley, you get here to Gothic Mountain, and I'm now sitting on the backside from this picture on the backside of Gothic Mountain in the East River Valley. If I hike partway up Gothic Mountain and look back at the town of Gothic, which is the site of the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, this is the view from about this time of year. During the summer, during a normal summer, there are about 180 people and residents here in this former mining town of Gothic. And they're biologists from all over the country and some internationally that come to work here for the summer field season. So it's a very, very busy place. It's actually probably the most active field station in the world based on how many people come and how many publications are generated by those people. During the winter, that same view, you can see it's a lot of snow. Now, on average, about almost 11 meters of snow falls during the winter here, with a big range. It's been anywhere from 4.7 to 16.4 meters of snow that falls. And here's a graph showing since 1975 how much snow has fallen in Gothic. And you can note there's a low point here back in 1976, 77. That was the winter that convinced all the Colorado ski areas they had to put in snowmaking equipment because they weren't able to open at Thanksgiving time, or some of them even at Christmas time. This winter of 94, 95, which is the high point here, is when I took this picture in the lower right, and we could ski off the roofs of the buildings in Gothic. I happened to be living here that winter. And those data come from a friend of mine named Billy Barr, who's worked at RMBL since the early 70s. Starting about 5 years ago, to be very interested in what he was doing. He got a lot of attention. I think that started maybe with this video called the Snow Guardian. There's a link to that. If you do a Google search of Snow Guardian, you'll quickly pull up a number of news articles about a film from Germany, China, CBS Morning News, and Denmark and a variety of places around the world come out to visit Billy, who's spends most of his time up here in his cabin in Gothic. And it turned out that after his, or during his first winter up here, just after he'd graduated from college, I think he was kind of bored. And so he started writing down every day how much snow fell, how much was on the ground, and also keeping track of things like when he saw the first marmot in the spring, when he saw the first hunter, when he saw the first glacier lily. And that's turned out to be a fantastic record for those of us interested in climate change and how the climate's been changing up here. So if we look at some of his records, for instance, for what's the total snowfall in Gothic, and somewhat arbitrarily break it on these two time periods. In the first 5, 10, 15, first 20 years or so, there was a trend with a lot of variation towards increasing winter snowfall in Gothic. And then more recently, that trend has reversed and we're seeing less snowfall happening in Gothic. And this graph is the first of several that I might point out the value of long-term records. You know, without Billy Bars having written this information down, we wouldn't have this record to be able to go back and look at and try and figure out how is the climate changing. If you look at what's the first date of bare ground, more information of Billy's, back in that winter, a very little snowpack, it melted the 26th of April. And that was a record up until 2012 when the snow melted on the 23rd of April. I've again somewhat arbitrarily broken this into two time periods, showing that it looks like things are made sort of a jump here after the mid to late 90s. And since then, it has been quite a bit earlier than it used to be. Another point I'll try and make with that graph is that if you look at these data, starting with 95, which was a record snowfall year, and running that record up until 2002, there's a very strong trend towards earlier snowmelt. And so after those 9 years, see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, after those 8 years, I really thought we were in trouble because there was this really strong trend towards earlier snowmelt. But since then, the trend has leveled out again. And so even though we had 8 years of data here, that was not enough to be able to make to understand the long-term story. We really have to have decades of data in order to understand this pattern. I've been able to extend our understanding back a little bit by using records from a stream gauge at Almont on the East River between Gunnison and Crested Butte, where the data go back to the 1930s. And I'm sure you can understand that it makes sense that how much snow we get in Gothic can influence how much water runs off in the river. And when the snow melts in Gothic determines when the peak runoff happens down at Almont. And so I can use those records from the stream gauge in Almont to estimate how much snow did we get in Gothic and when did it melt back to the 1930s. So it's fun to be able to extend our understanding that far back. Why is the snow melting earlier? Two reasons. One is that we're getting less snow than we used to, and the other is that it's warmer in the spring. So this graph from Crested Butte shows what was the average low temperature in April from the 1970s up until present. And there's a pretty striking trend. It's a lot warmer now. It gets a lot less cold in April than it used to. And that's another reason that the snow is melting earlier. Another reason is what we call dust on snow events. So here's a picture looking at the peaks outside Crested Butte, and you can see how dirty the snow is below the fresh snow at the top of the peaks. And if you were to dig into the snowpack, do a cross section of the snowpack, you can see these dust on snow events that leave a band of dirt in the snow. And the problem with dirty snow is that it doesn't reflect heat the way clean snow does. It absorbs heat, and that can make the snow melt about a week or 10 days earlier than it would have otherwise. And if the snow is melting earlier, that means it's not maintaining a reservoir of water up in the mountains to melt throughout the summer and help feed the streams, help feed the irrigation ditches. Where does that dust come from? Here's a picture from Phoenix, Arizona from the summer, but showing the kind of dust storms that you can get in that part of Arizona. And most of that dust ends up blowing up north. And here's a weather forecast that I copied off of the National Weather Service from March 2012. And the forecast for that day was blowing dust in March. And that was also the forecast for all these other parts of Colorado and also into Utah and parts and some of Arizona. So these events seem to be becoming more common, in part because of climate change, in part because of maybe more human disturbance than there used to be, breaking up the crust that protected the desert from wind erosion. So the combination of warmer temperatures and dust on snow events is making this peak runoff date down in the stream gauge at Almont happen earlier than it used to. There was a tipping point here back maybe around 1980. But that's not good news for fly fishermen. It's not good news for whitewater rafters. It's not good news for the ranchers that need that irrigation water throughout the summer if the peak is happening earlier and they're losing that water that they would normally have had access to later in the summer. So a couple of graphs showing that, yeah, snowmelt date's getting earlier and the mean temperatures are going up. And one of the consequences of those changes, which is maybe seems somewhat paradoxical, given that we're talking about global warming, is that we're seeing more frost events, I think, and frost can significantly reduce flower abundance. Here's the picture from the 13th of June, 2001. It got down to 21 degrees Fahrenheit. You can see that the plants had already come up. And I don't have I'm not including a picture from this summer, but we had a similar event earlier in June this year where it also got down to about 27 one night, 25 the next night. And all it takes is one night of that cold temperature if the plants have already developed to kill a lot of frost-sensitive buds. So this is a temperature record from, let's see, 2004, showing the event where it got down to 25 degrees on the 11th of June. So typically, historically, the last frost has usually happened here about the 10th or 15th of June. And back when the snow didn't melt until the beginning of June, that wasn't a problem for the plants because they hadn't started to develop buds yet. But now when we have snow melt happening sometimes in the middle of April, by the time the 10th of June rolls around, the plants are, many of them are well developed. Some have started flowering already. And some of the plants that have frost sensitive buds then get their buds killed. One more example showing, in this case, the temperatures starting in August, and they bounce around a lot, daily highs and lows. And we got some snow in November, and that wasn't a very heavy snow winter, and the snow melted and the temperature started varying again. It got down to below 0 on the ground. And then finally, we got enough snow to keep the temperature cold, right around freezing for the rest of the winter. But then in April, the snow melted, and then once again, we started getting temperature extremes, including down into the teens in May or early April. I'll skip that temperature graph, but that just shows that we again got down to 25 degrees up until the 2nd of June. One of the plants that I worked on for decades that's sensitive to frost is this Helianthella quinquenervis, common name is the aspen sunflower. There are some of those flowering right now down at the ski area in Crested Butte. I saw them when I drove through there yesterday. And one of the reasons I started studying that plant was because I started noticing that when I found the flower buds, they always had, almost always had ants on them. And it turns out these plants are secreting a solution of sugars and amino acids at the back of the flower buds, and that attracts the ants. So the ants are collecting that rich resource, and while they're wandering around on the plant, they're chasing away flies that are trying to lay their eggs in the flower heads. So the plants are putting almost all their defense budget into attracting ants and not into chemicals that might make the plants taste bad. And so here's an herbivore, a porcupine that's eating a flower bud, and it's about to eat this one, and then it's going to eat that one. And so these herbivores like porcupines and deer and elk, and as it turns out, also cows and sheep love to eat these buds, and they aren't completely protected from the herbivory by ants, unfortunately. In a good flowering year, this is what the meadow where I was working this afternoon actually looks like. But the same meadow this year is going to look like this, same time, same spot. But this is a year with a frost, as was this year, and there'll be no flowering. I've done a couple of plots counts every year since the 1970s of how many flowers I find. And these zeros are years with frost damage, where most of the buds were killed. And 2020 is going to be about a zero down here. So if you look at how many unfrosted flower, how many good flower heads there are, like this picture in the lower right, versus frosted buds, like the one in the upper left, and plot that against when the snow melted. If the snow melts early, then there aren't many flowers. If the snow melts late, then there are lots of flowers, because if the snow melted late, then they were protected from frost. These plants are long-lived perennials. Here's some that I've dug up, and I think some of these probably live to be at least 80 years old, maybe as long as 100 years. And so if they don't produce flowers for a year or two because of frost, that's not a big deal, because they have many other years to make seeds. But if those frosts become more common and they're not making seeds, then chances are they're going to have a more difficult time replacing themselves. This kind of frost event, sometimes people are calling these a false spring, because we have a warm spell in March or April and then followed by a frost. That's also affecting agriculture. So here's a picture from the Denver Post where the farmers at the farmers market were apologizing for how expensive the peaches are because they had a 70% loss due to frost. And that's happened this year too, down around Fruta. They lost all the apricots. They lost most of the fruit. Peaches in Paonia, which is in the North Fork Valley, which is a big fruit growing region, we've lost the apricots and cherries this year. There'll be some apples, but not many peaches or nectarines probably. And that's happening around the world. Grape crops are being affected. It's happening across many parts of the US. There have been some big freezes that have affected agriculture to the tune of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in the Midwest and in the East Coast as well. Let me go back to that graph I showed you a minute ago about the number of sunflowers I've counted. And if you look at that, it sort of looks like they're cycles. And I think, in fact, there are cycles going on. And this is another example of why we need decades of data in order to understand what's happening with the wildflowers here, because I certainly wouldn't have picked up on that fact if I'd done a 2-year, a 3-year, a 4-year, an 8-year study. And if you're an ecologist and relying on grant funding from the National Science Foundation, most of those grants are for 2 or 3 years at a time, and they're very difficult to get. They're very competitive right now. Under 10% of the people who are applying for funding are getting it. So a lot of good science is not being funded because there isn't enough money. But I've been fortunate enough to, through a combination of sources, including most recently from the National Science Foundation, to keep this project going for long enough to be able to find things like those cycles. There was an interesting paper published in 2010 by some climatologists, and they looked at climate records from Northern California, the Central Rocky Mountains, and Minnesota and Quebec. And in all those places, they found evidence for long-term cycles happening. And here in the Central Rocky Mountains, they found cycles of about 12 to 14 years. They couldn't figure out what's creating those cycles. All they could say was, well, here's the data. We're seeing cycles developing. And so what I've done is to cut out of their graph for the most recent part of the Central Rocky Mountain cycle and superimpose that over some data here from Gothic. In this case, what's the date of year of snowmelt. And because these data are so variable from year to year, what I did was to take 8-year running intervals and calculate what's the trend for the first 8 years, the next 8 years, the next 8 years, the next 8 years. And those trends end up producing essentially the same cycles that those climatologists found. So I'm pretty confident that we're seeing here in our climate the same thing that they found of an 8-year cycle. And that seems to be affecting some of the flowering as well. So what about the interactions between these wildflowers and pollinators? How are they being affected? And I'm going to tell a story about a butterfly, a fritillary butterfly that one of my colleagues here at the biological lab has studied. And she told me at one point that she had a 9-year data set, which is pretty long for a butterfly study, that she hadn't published yet because she couldn't figure out why the population sizes were so variable from year to year. And she happened to mention to me that these butterflies are very reliant on this Erigeron speciosus, this fleabane daisy, for nectar. And the butterflies are a little bit unusual because the number of eggs that a female can lay depends on how much nectar they can collect. A lot of butterflies use the energy that they gathered as caterpillars to make the eggs that they then lay for the next generation. But this butterfly needs the nectar, and they get almost all their nectar from that one species of wildflower. And I told her, well, I have a lot of long-term data for that wildflower. Why don't we put our data together and see if we can figure out if there's an interaction? And I'll finish that story in a minute. But let me tell you first how we get those flower data that I offered her. This is a kind of phenological clock. Up here in the upper part is spring beauty. That's the first thing to flower when the snow melts. And then the willows start to flower, and then the glacier lilies, and then the larkspurs, and down to violets. And right now we're seeing roses, and Frasera, the monument plant, is flowering now. The helianthus is just starting to flower, and we're seeing some bluebells. Then later on, we'll see the Mariposa lilies and the paintbrushes, and come around to the lilacs, the gentians at the end of the summer. And all of those are floral resources for the pollinators like the hummingbirds and the bumblebees, and for that butterfly species. Well, the information we have about the phenology and the abundance of those flowers comes from going out there every other day for the whole growing season, and we've now done that since 1973. So we have this fantastic long-term record that we've been able to put together for flowering. And we can say, for instance, what's the first day of flowering for spring beauties, and how does that depend on when the snow melts? Well, you can see it's very closely tied to snow melt. That's a pretty straight line. There is some variation. Those points all don't all fall exactly on the line, but there's also a huge amount of variation. So we've seen that flowering start as early as the 24th of April and as late up here as the 14th of June. So we have now data for about 120 different wildflower species that we can make graphs like this. For the bluebells that's now flowering, here's some data for how many of those bluebells did we count. And for the first few decades of our study, those numbers were going up. But then starting around the late 90s, those numbers crashed, and they're still there in most cases, but almost no flowers. And I think what's happened is it's now gotten too warm or too dry for this flower. We know that these bluebells used to occur down around Crested Butte back in the 1970s when some of us were doing work down there. And we know that those plants are no longer there down around Crested Butte. Pretty soon they may no longer be here up in Gothic. So they seem to be moving up. At least the bottom end of their range is moving up in altitude. We haven't, unfortunately, been following them as closely to see if they're moving up the mountains, which is a possibility. So let me get back to that butterfly and how it interacts with the flowers. It turns out that that daisy, that erigeron that it visits, is also sensitive to frost. So very similar to the story you heard about the aspen sunflower. If we look at how many flowers did we count each year and plot that against, in this case, how much snow is left on the ground on the 30th of April, in the years with not much snow and early snowmelt, there aren't many flowers. And by putting that data set together with the butterflies, we were able to figure out what's the population growth rate of the butterflies from one year to the next. And what, on the x-axis on the bottom here is the ratio of how many flowers per butterflies did we count one year. If the ratio is negative, that means there weren't many flowers per butterfly. If the numbers are higher, that means there were a lot of flowers per butterfly. And the females got lots of nectar, they laid lots of eggs, and the next year, the population grew. And for most insect populations, we don't know what makes a good year for mosquitoes, what makes a good year for butterflies, what makes a good year for whatever insects that we're interested in. So it's pretty unusual that for this butterfly, we were able to figure out almost all of the variation from one year to the next is explained by what's happening with the flowers and the effects of frost. And so that's a nice link showing that decreasing snowpack, warmer springs means earlier snow melt, an increased incidence of frost damage, and that means there'll be fewer flowers and less nectar for the butterflies, and the following year there'll be fewer butterflies. So yes, we know now that climate change is having a direct impact on some of these pollinators up at this altitude. We also know that queen bumblebees are moving up in altitude, and that's because there were a couple of us back in 1973 and 74 studying bumblebees here, and we walked up this trail between Gothic Mountain and Baldy Mountain about once a week and counted the different bumblebees that we saw and also the wildflowers that we saw along that transect. And then we went back and repeated that in 2007 and found that the queens of 8 different bumblebee species had moved up in altitude about 230 meters, so about 700 feet in altitude. We meant to redo that survey this year, but because the students and research assistants are mostly not able to get here to the biological lab this summer, we're going to have to put that repeat off, but we'll be till another year. But we're suspecting that we'll find that the bumblebees are continuing to move up in altitude. And that poses a question, well, what happens when these lower altitude bumblebee species move up and run into the alpine bumblebee species that are already up here in the higher altitudes? Are they going to push these high altitude species of bumblebees to extinction because they can't go any higher? Or is there just going to be a lot more competition for flowers up here if all those species manage to hang on together? So I guess that's something we're hoping to get an answer to in the future. If we look at when did the first glacier lily bloom and plot that against how much snow is left on the ground at the end of April, the more snow, the later the glacier lilies flower. And for hummingbirds, more data from Billy Barr, we know that the more snow, the later the snow melts, the later we see those hummingbirds up here. And the hummingbirds visit these flowers. They're not very good pollinators of them, but this is a very important nectar resource when these hummingbirds first arrive at this altitude. And note that those lines are not parallel. They're not changing at the same rate. So that tells us that the phenology of the pollinators is not changing at the same direction or the same rate anyway as the flowers. And if that trend continues, at some point in the future, the glacier lilies may be done blooming by the time the hummingbirds finally get here. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens to those kinds of trends in the future. If we look at our flowering data over the whole growing season, what we've done here is split our data into 2 time periods. The earlier time period is in blue and the later time period in red. And note that the later time period shows that the growing season is starting earlier than it used to, and it's lasting longer than it used to. So the growing season is getting longer. That's this graph up here in the upper left too, showing how long is the flowering season. And the flowering season is getting longer. Well, you might think, well, that's good because their flowers are around for a longer period of time. But one thing we're concerned about is that there seem to be 2 peaks of flowering. There's an early peak and a later peak, and then a low point that's developing in between those 2 peaks. And that low point is getting even lower than it used to be. But this middle of the season is when hummingbirds need nectar for their babies and the bumblebees need nectar for their offspring. So what happens if as the seasons are getting pulled further and further apart, that mid-season low gets lower and lower? So that's another trend that we're a little concerned about and are trying to keep track of. About 11 years ago now, I invited a friend, Becky Irwin, who's the last author on this paper. She's now at North Carolina State University, to start censusing bees, sampling bees in the same meadows where we're sampling the flowers. And so we now have an 11-year record for what's happening with the bees in the same areas where we've got the flower data. And Jane Ogilvie was a postdoc working for us, and she did a very nice analysis of looking at the changes in bumblebees over the years. She's picked 3 of the dozen or so bumblebee species that we have here. And for each of these species, she looked at what's the effect of snowpack and rainfall, and what's the effect of when the snow melt dates, and how does that influence how many days during the year flowers are available and how many flowers are available. And it turns out there is an effect of precipitation and snowmelt date that affects those floral resources, but those effects, when we look in turn on how that affects the bees, they're not all being affected in the same way. So for instance, in Bombus flavifrons, the floral sum doesn't seem to affect its abundance. It's only how many days during the summer are flowers available that's affecting it. So that means we can't say, oh, this is what's happening to all bumblebees. We really have to look at each different species of bee. Becky has found about 140 different species of bees here at the biological lab. There are about, let's see, I think almost in Colorado, almost 1,000 different species of native bees. And so a pretty good chunk of them, maybe it was closer to 180 species that we have here just in around Crested Butte. And so we should eventually be able to put the story together for how the bees are being affected by the flowers for all of those species of bees, but we're still working on collecting those data and doing the analyses. If we look at that whole community of flowers, and let's say this first graph might be spring beauty, and then the erythronium, and then the larkspurs, and then the mertensia, and then the gentians. Let's say historically, this was their relationship and when they came into bloom. And so one question is, well, what's happening now? Did they all just shift to flower earlier? Or are they changing, are they all changing in different ways? And it turns out that seems to be what's actually happening. They're changing in different ways. So some of them are not flowering as much early as others are. Some of them have longer flowering periods than they used to. Some of them, the peaks aren't the same place they used to be. So we really have to look at each different species of wildflower to understand what's happening at the community level. And we do know that the poor floral abundance days seem to be increasing as the temperature gets warmer and we're having more problems with drought. And so what this graph shows is for bumblebees, for solitary bees, for flies, for butterflies, and for hummingbirds, how are those poor floral abundance days impacting them? And it turns out if these colored lines overlap with the dashed line here, that means there's no significant difference. So for hummingbirds, the poor floral abundance days don't seem to be increasing. But for all these other groups of pollinators, except for 1 year's worth of data for the solitary bees, there does seem to be a significant influence or significant increase in poor floral abundance days. There's not as many flowers around as there used to be for those pollinators. And snow melt date, when the snow is melting, seems to be responsible for that effect for 11 of the 13 species. Temperature doesn't seem to have so much of an effect. Precipitation doesn't have to seem so much of a direct effect on the pollinators. It's really whether or not, when the snow melts, it's having the impact on flower abundance and then in turn affecting the pollinators. So these measures of how many flowers are available are changing divergently for these different groups of pollinators. So we can't say, here's what's happening for pollinators. We can say what's happening for hummingbirds, what's happening for bumblebees, what's happening for flies. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about 2, 3 more species in detail. This one that I've also worked on for decades, Fraser speciosa, and it's what we call mass flowering. These are big flowering years, and then followed by other years where there are no flowers. Last year was a mass flowering year, and in this one meadow at the biological lab, there were about 3,000 of those gentians flowering. Actually, I haven't counted this year, but I haven't seen any there. There might be 1 or 2 this year. These plants, when they do bloom, make flowers that are very attractive to pollinators. They make lots of nectar. Here's a bumblebee collecting nectar. And we've been studying the demography, the population biology of these plants, in particular up in the Alpine tundra at Cumberland Pass, where we started this project in 1973. And we have a string grid that we put out so we can map these plants. Here's some of the non-flowering plants, those green rosettes. Here's an old flower stalk. And here are the data for one plant. So we tagged that plant as a seedling, a recruit, in 1982. I didn't find it the next 2 years because it was so small, but then it had 2 leaves for the next 10, 20, 30 years, got all the way up to 4 leaves once or twice, but then I haven't seen it since. So that plant was 10, 20, 30, 32 years old when it died, and it only had either 2 or 4 leaves. Here's a picture of it when it was 30 years old. And you can see next to my thumb here, it was not very big after 30 years of growth up in the Alpine tundra. Here's another one that is now 10, 20, 30, 40, at least 46 years old. Because I don't know how old it was when I first found it as a 2-leaf plant in 1974. It might have already been 30 years old at that point. And here's a picture of it when it was at least 40 years old and still had just 2 leaves. And the last one, this was a plant that was a seedling in 1994. Here it is when it was 25 years old. And next to a research assistant who was only about 23 years old. So she was not as old as that plant that she was looking for. Here's an old flower stalk up in the Alpine tundra. They don't get to be very big. And here's that plant, or a plant that was at least 41 years old. So how many leaves do they have to have before they flower? We go up there each year and count how many leaves they have. On average, they flower once they've reached about 25 or 30 leaves, but some of them have flowered as small as 12 leaves. And here's one that waited till it was 64 leaves. And I'm guessing that a plant like that is at least 100 years old before it flowers once and dies. I know for a handful of plants exactly how old they were when they flowered because I planted some seeds down at the biological lab and kept track of those plants. And the first one of those that flowered was 21 years old. That flowered in 2003. And then some of them flowered in 2005, some more in 2010. And then last year, it could be that the last of them flowered last year at 37 years at this altitude of about 1,500 feet. I was fortunate that when they built this new building at the biological lab, they were able to save this experiment so that I could see what happened after 37 years. The original plan for the building was to cover up those plants. I've done an annual count since 1979 of the number of flowering gentians that I see from the road in the East River Valley. I've now counted 135,325 flower stalks. And the biggest year for flowering was last year when over 30,000 plants were flowering. This year, it'll probably be about 10 or something like that. So that gives you an idea of how big those changes can be. I know that these 3 years, 69, 73, and 70, what is that, 77, were good flowering years, but I didn't count them those years. So what makes for a good flowering year? And this is a picture on the backside of Crested Butte Mountain in Brush Creek. It turns out that I think it's summer rain, how much rain we get during the summer. If we get a lot of rain, that triggers the flowering, but it takes them 4 years to make those flower stalks underground before we actually see them above ground. So here's a correlation, a statistical measure of looking at 1 year after, 1 year after a wet summer, 2 years after a wet summer, 3 years after a wet summer, and then all of a sudden here at 4 years after a wet summer, we get a very strong correlation between how much rain there was and how many flower stalks. It took me over 30 years to figure that out. So there's another reason why long-term data are good. And it turns out these plants preform leaves. So in the background here, you can see how big, how big a current year's leaf is. And if you pull off all those current year's leaves down inside at the top of the root, you can find these little leaves that would have been next year's leaves, and then the next year's leaves, and then the next year's leaves, all the way down to when they're almost microscopic. And I have a couple times found preformed flower stalks that would have been a big flower stalk if I hadn't dug up that plant sometime 2 or 3 years in the future. So if you look at how many flower stalks I've counted, plotted against May to July rain 4 years ago, you get this very strong relationship. It turns out there's at least one other alpine plant, a polygonum species, that also takes 4 years to make the flower stalks underground. Almost all these plants that I'm looking at here at 9,500 feet are long-lived perennials, and many of them preform leaves or flower buds, but most of them probably only 1 year, possibly 2 years in advance. So this is unusual that it takes 4 years. Another interesting plant I work with is this one, which is a veratrum, false skunk cabbage, and the people from the biological lab dress up in the leaves of those plants on the 4th of July. And that they also are massed flowering, and very impressive when they do flower. And different clones flower at different times. So this clone is in full bloom, but this one back here is not yet fully open. Here's another smaller clone that's not open yet, and a big clone in the back that is flowering. Here's a clone that we think, based on how slowly they grow and how big that clone is probably about 500 or 600 years old. And we tried to find out, is there a rainfall cue that triggers flowering in this plant? They don't have the same flowering pattern as the gentians, but we think, yes, there is an environmental effect. If you have a cool summer, and these plants do preform, so they don't flower the next year, but we think that 2 years after a cool summer, you get flowering. And if that's true, then we look at the temperature records from 1928 to 1983, then about 1 in every 5 years was cool enough to trigger this kind of mass flowering event that we see here in the East River Valley. That's Gothic Mountain behind. But from 1984 to 2010, only 15% of the years have been cool enough to trigger flowering. And so as the climate warms, I think we're going to see fewer and fewer of these plants flowering. And it turns out they only reproduce clonally if they're flowering. So not only will they not produce seeds, but they may not be reproducing clonally anymore either. So I think this plant is going to be pretty strongly affected by climate change. And then one last example is this larkspur, which is an early species visited by bumblebees. Here's a queen that's been collecting nectar and pollen. It's visited by the broad-tailed hummingbirds. And here's another plant that I count, and you can see that it has ups and downs, and it turns out how many flowers we get is very strongly determined by how much snow we had the previous winter. And here's a graph showing the maximum number of either flowers in the upper line or plants flowering in the lower line. And the more snow we get, the more plants flower and the more flowers they make. So as we get less snow, we're going to see fewer flowers. It turns out these plants, if you look at the top of a flower stalk, often or almost always abort one or more of their buds for reasons I haven't figured out yet. And the number of buds that they abort seems to be going up over the years. And that may have something to do with climate change too. I still haven't figured out exactly what's happening there. But let me skip through those. I'll finish up here saying that the climate's changing, snowmelt dates are getting earlier. That means flowering starts earlier. There's more frost damage that's beginning to affect plant demography, their population biology. Pollinators, we know, are being affected now. And the variation in the way different species are responding to the climate is going to lead to different kinds of interactions between plants and pollinators or among different plants. So every year, what we're doing is coming out and looking at these relationships among regional climate, local climate, frost effects, the timing and the abundance of flowering, when the migrants get here, what's happening to pollination. So every year, things are a little bit different, and we learn a little bit more. If you ever are interested in what we're finding out, there's a website about the RMBL Phenology Project, which tells you how you can get some information if you ever wanted about these species that we're following or the papers that we're publishing about it. So if you ever were to get over here and see the wildflower capital of Colorado, this is the trail on the way up to West Maroon Pass, you would now see plants that you know something more about, like this gentian. You know that this is only going to flower once and then it's going to die, that it means that it 4 years ago was a good rainfall year. You know something about the larkspurs that I talked about, but there's more to learn here that I'm going to learn about in my lifetime. We do know that there's more sagebrush now here in the shadow of Crested Butte Mountain. Sagebrush is favored by warm, dry summers. And one possibility is that 50 years from now, instead of having the Crested Butte Wildflower Festival, there's going to be the Crested Butte Sagebrush Festival, which I'm guessing will not be as attractive to tourists as the Wildflower Festival is. The Social Security Agency now estimates that I'm going to live 15 more years. So I'm hoping I can get 15 more data points out of all these wildflowers that you're learning about and have some more interesting stories to tell. I'm fortunate that my son, who's also an ecologist, he and his wife are both ecologists actually. They met here at the biological lab when they were teenagers. They're now both faculty members at Florida State University. And starting about 5 years ago, they decided to start working out here and collaborating with me. And so I'm going to be fortunate to have a second generation being able to keep some of these projects going. Those of you that are taxpayers and going to be sending your checks into the federal government for the 15th of July deadline, a very small proportion of your taxes end up going to the National Science Foundation, and a very small proportion of their budget ends up coming out to support this project. So I'll thank you as taxpayers for your support for the National Science Foundation. And I think I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to try and answer any questions that you might have.
Well, David, so far no one has submitted any questions. So I don't know if anybody would like to get one in at the last minute before David signs off. I'll keep my eyes open. I just have one that says a great presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicole.
And I think also the people really appreciated your long-term data set. I know I do for sure.
Well, it's fun to be able to share these stories. I think one of the roles of scientists, particularly scientists who are getting public support, is to make sure that we share what we're learning with the general public. And so I'm always happy to have opportunities like this to talk with your members and help share that information. And when they go out hiking up in the Alpine now, they'll know some stories that they can share with their friends.
All right, and Nicola would like to know what we at the Gardens could do to help with your project. Would it be really worthwhile for us to start doing some flowering time measurements here?
Sure, sure. Citizen science is great. There, in fact, if you want, you can go to that National Phenology Network site and set yourself up an account where you can record your observations, and that information then becomes available to scientists all around the world. So that's one way you can help to contribute by doing something as simple as keeping track of when did you see the first, let's say, columbine flower in your yard each year. I noticed somebody else asking about cloud seeding. There is cloud seeding in this part of Colorado that goes on. I'm not absolutely convinced that it has an effect, but I guess the people who are paying for the cloud seeding, which I think includes Gunnison County actually, seem to think that there must be a demonstrable effect. And so I think the silver iodide particles that they're putting up into the clouds probably don't have an effect on the plants. But if there is more snow, yeah, that's going to have an impact. And in general, the more snow we get, the better the flowering is. Somebody also asked about the massed flowering event of gentians last year. It did happen over large parts of Colorado. I didn't, I guess the last time there was a big flowering year, I actually sent out messages to a number of people around Colorado and into Utah and into New Mexico, where I knew the plant grew. And all those people said, yeah. And I think it makes sense. If we have a wet summer here in the East River Valley, it's probably a wet summer over the areas where that plant grows. So I think those massed flowering events do happen over very broad geographical areas, not just locally.
All right, well, I think that's it for the questions, and I think we've met our 7 o'clock deadline. So David, I really appreciate you taking a little time out of your research there at Rumble, and sorry we didn't get to see you in person this year.
Yeah, well, hopefully next summer the Rumble Visitor Center will be open, and if you get over here, stop by and you can learn a little bit more about the research that goes on here. And if you think of questions later on that you want to ask, send me an email message and I'll try to get an answer to you.
Yeah, so I'll tell anyone here that if you'd like to, if you think of any questions for David, you can definitely email me here at the Betty Ford Alpine Gardens and I can pass them on. Thanks a lot, David.
Okay, yep, you're welcome.
Bye-bye.